Last video, I presented the idea of getting inspiration for your games. More specifically, I advised you to take the advice of Benjamin Franklin, who said that originality is the art of concealing your sources. In other words, if you want to get a starting point for developing a story on which you can build your campaign, gather inspirations from the stuff that you like to read, to watch, and to play, in the case of books and comics, films and shows, and video games, respectively, or even board games. Then, once you have your inspiration, metaphorically file off the serial numbers, or as the video gaming people call it when taking stuff they've already made and adjusting it so it looks a little different, reskin the source material until it takes on a more unique flavor. Seriously, it worked just fine for Walt Disney when his studio reused footage for various scenes, like the time they swapped out Maid Marian for Snow White for the dance number in Robin Hood, so I don't see any reason why you shouldn't do the same with your gaming inspirations. On this same topic, I introduced the idea of breaking stuff apart to get the sticky juices inside, the building blocks that make up the parts of a given story, and then collecting those building blocks and putting them together in new and different ways until you're happy with the new look, feel, and flavor of the new starting point for your campaign idea. In other words, think of those parts as your fuel for inspiration, but bear in mind, all of that is just the starting point. Getting to that starting point can be the most difficult part of developing a good story. It can also be the easiest. Sometimes inspiration flows instantly and you can jot down the whole outline for a new and decent campaign in a matter of hours. Other times it takes time and countless hours of slow, ponderous, and careful consideration, and you'll be constantly adding to the idea, taking away stuff that doesn't work, swiping bits from other random ideas you had, and then polishing them up to squeeze into the new setting, and so forth. But once you've got that starting point, and you've got the basics of an outline for what you want your overall story to look like, while still leaving plenty of gaps, of course. After all, you're only the primary storyteller here, not the only one at the gaming table. Then comes the real work. Research. Anybody who's written an academic essay should know that research is actually hard work when it's being done right. I've put some links below the video box that give the process of doing professional-grade research, and I'll be drawing heavily upon them and some other sources that I use on a regular basis. Fortunately for you, you're not doing academic-grade research here. You're doing personal research, which means that you don't have to ensure that you always use primary sources, or verify your sources, or reference those sources correctly. You should if you plan to make games in a professional field, and if you do, I direct your attention to the back of almost every GURPS 3rd edition splat book ever made for some of the most kick-butt lists of reference material I've ever seen in role-playing games. But for the most part, you only really need to keep track of your sources so that you can go back to them later for future inspiration. And you don't have to worry about verifying their validity. All that matters is that your sources help you to tell an awesome story through your role-playing games. So, how do you do research? Okay, this is going to be hard work and it's going to hurt. So, buckle in, strap down, suck it up, and don't let yourself get too stressed. You know what you're in for, and actually it doesn't have to be all that bad. For example, have you ever lost yourself for a few hours reading Wikipedia? What about tvtropes.com, or the Something Awful forums, or one of its related websites, like the Let's Play archives, or even just browsing through information videos on YouTube and other sites? Or maybe of playing a video game that you really couldn't stop enjoying. That's all research, or at least its opening stages. For this sort of work, it's a labor of love, not a chore of drudgery. So sometimes you actually might not realize that you're doing some of the hard work of researching your campaign, except for one big thing. You're going to be taking notes. That's the first major skill that you're going to need to learn, by the way, taking notes. That's an essential skill for life anyway, so I suggest you deal with it. When I was a kid, I was lucky enough to have a guy by the name of Richard Peck come to my school and give a presentation on creative writing. I think I was about 10, possibly 12 at the time. Now, before I say anything else, I'm going to give you a serious warning. The dude won a Newbery Medal, and right away that means his books are highly suspect, to put it very mildly. After he read some of his stuff to his kids, including a poem about a pregnant doe he'd hit and then pushed off the side of the road to clear the way for other cars, I decided that unless something really strange happened in my life, I wasn't going to read his books voluntarily, and thus far that has remained the case. That all said, though, he made a fantastic suggestion in that presentation that stuck with me all these years. Always have something on hand so you can write notes. You never know when a thought will come, when inspiration will strike, a phenomenon pointed out by the great author Terry Pratchett, and which he actually called inspiration particles in his Discworld series of books. And so when that inspiration does hit, you absolutely must have some way to record it, or else the thought will slip away and move off into the ethers, perhaps never to be recovered, no matter how much you pummel your poor gray cells. Actually, I personally believe that the more you seek out inspiration and then act on it when it comes, at the very least to write it down, the more likely you will be to get more of it in the future. So, learning the fine art of taking notes is actually a great way to get started on the process of receiving inspiration, and then toward getting more. As far as I can tell, how you take down those notes doesn't really matter. Little notepad.txt files on your computer, Google Docs documents, a sticky note app on your smartphone, a stack of 3x5 cards stuck in your pocket or bag, one of those handy pocket notebooks, a college-ruled one-subject jobber, or a fat binder stuffed with loose-leaf paper. It doesn't matter, just so long as you've got something. Actually, keep at least 2 of those somethings around, just in case, plus extra pens and pencils or a cable charger for use on demand. I mean, inspirations are important, and you don't want to risk the power in your smartphone giving out or your last pen suddenly running out of ink at the worst of all possible moments. Murphy's Law is always in effect, after all, so even though I'm no engineer, I try to think like one in that regard, and plan and replan and plan again to account for what to do when that worst possible thing does eventually happen. The world might end in fire and flood, plague might devastate the nations, the hungry dead might come shambling to the gates, and starvation looms large. But at least I'll have enough pens and pads of paper to keep track of those inspirations when they come, and a flickering candle by which to write them. I mean, really, let's focus on the important stuff here. Assuming all along that you're going to be taking copious notes on all the stuff that strikes you as important or useful or just kind of interesting, either as an idea that you'll use in the campaign you're working on now or in some other setting, or just because it's cool and you want to remember it for later, well, now we can get on to the next big step in research, actually getting out there and searching for stuff. When you're engaged in the process of doing research for a campaign, I suggest that you go from the stuff that's most obvious to the stuff that's less obvious. In the case of designing a story for a campaign, there are 2 really big, easy, obvious sources of inspiration. The first one, the game books of the system that you intend to use, and the second is the source material for your inspiration, i.e. the source that you're stealing from as your major starting point, whatever it might be. As you start to semi-consciously do your research, reading game books and enjoying whatever entertainment media you like best, you've already started the 5-step process by which research is done. The first, most important, and most complicated step in a research process is to ask yourself the big questions. This is the stuff that will eventually lead you to developing the themes and guiding principles behind your entire work. You don't need to really get an answer to those big questions right away. Just keep them in mind, letting them settle into the back of your consciousness to percolate and bubble away, until eventually you can rattle something coherent and useful free of your gray matter. So what are the big questions? Well, that varies by the genre in which you're writing, of course, but since you're working on developing the setup for a role-playing game, you've only got a fairly short list. First on that list is, how can I turn this into a game? As you read, watch, and play other stuff, you should let that first big question be humming there in the back of your thoughts, taking stuff in, and starting the long and intense process of breaking it up into component bits that you can then reassemble for your own use in building that game. When I say game, by the way, I refer directly to the second of these big questions, which is, what is the scope of my game? In other words, how much time and space do you have to fill? Is this just meant to be a 3 to 4 hour job or something for a conference? Or maybe to introduce some new players to role-playing? Or to try out a game system? Or are you aiming for something bigger? Something big enough, in fact, to potentially last years? Maybe even a campaign setting so big it survives through multiple campaigns. Speaking of multiple campaigns, another of the big questions is, what is the ultimate goal of the campaign? This is a much more specific question, one that starts to really make your game a solid entity. It can also be broken down into a few smaller questions, such as, what is the tone of my game? With answers varying much like toast, light to dark and all shades in between, or toast or pastries and bagels for you jokers out there. And what major themes do I want to include in this game? Once you've answered it and all the lesser questions attached to it, then you're probably ready to stop doing quite so much research and instead spend some of that time that you used to spend building your game world to instead actually play in your game world. The really hard work is figuring out the big questions. Once you've got that settled, you just need to jot down some stats for the things your players are likely to interact with in a serious fashion, and you're all set to go. Seriously, whether it's a Goomba or a Goblin or a Goron, a Koopa or a Kobold or a Klingon, it's going to end up being about the same to your players, as long as the story's good. Naturally, if you're going to play, you're going to have players. So, of course, another really big question needs to be, what is the role of my players' characters in this story? Typically, the quick answer to that is heroes, but that's not always the case, especially in several different genres like cyberpunk, where the protagonists are quite regularly criminals of varying shades of grey morality. Seriously, check out William Gibson's Neuromancer for proof of that, and how flawed some highly competent protagonists can actually be. Actually, check out Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. It's more fun, in my opinion, and I like the characters a lot better. Also, Snow Crash has the rat things, and they're all sorts of bleeding-edge cool. Or you might look up the old video game Planescape Torment, which I think serves as a fantastic example of how to write up a huge, intricate, and fascinating setting, and then allow the player of the game, or players for a more tabletop-centered way of thinking, to navigate their own path through that game world and its underlying plot. The same goes for the Lone Wolf series of books, which are another take on the old choose-your-own-adventure sort of game books from back in the day, and a link to an online version of which I provided below, in case you wanted to play through them yourself and see what they're like. But back to the main subject. In other words, you're aiming to draft out the rough underpinnings of a plot, but you don't want to make that drafting so tightly scripted that your players don't have room for their own plots and plans and ideas. Finally, finding that happy medium is a pretty careful balance, one which I'll explore a great deal more in future videos, especially the one on railroads and sandboxes. But it's something to start thinking about now, and to keep in mind all the time as you work through the rest of the research process. And there's a final big question, and it's related to all the others. How can I use this in my game? This, of course, is anything that you might encounter along the way, after you've already settled on the general shape and scope of the game that you're going to run. Even after you've written up a whole campaign setting, there's always going to be blank spots, and there's always going to be a need for side quests, random encounters, interesting non-player characters, and role-playing opportunities to flesh out all the time spent in between all the big plot points of an overarching story. For me especially, one of the simplest ways that I've found to develop an adventure on the fly as part of an ongoing series is to flip through one of the books of monsters for the game I'm running, pick one that catches my attention somehow, and then ask a modified version of the preceding question. What is the situation in which my players as characters will encounter such a beastie in the game? In other words, and in far more general terms, you should never stop seeking out and writing down inspirations, and going through the continual process of preparing to use those ideas, getting them into steadily progressing stages of readiness. As I said before, the more you look for inspirations, the more of it you'll likely get, and I don't think that this is something you should ever try to turn off. After all, there's no telling when or if you'll be able to turn it back on. Once you've set those 5 big questions up into the back of your head, or however many big questions you finally decide on, you can vary that, and you feel them tickle your subconscious whenever you poke around in those murky recesses, you're ready to start the next stage of research, namely, gathering. Gathering is just what it sounds like. You're just scooping up big wads of inspiration sources without really being all that concerned about what they might be. You're mostly just aware of the big questions right now, but you probably haven't got any solid answers to them yet. So now you're going about your usual routine, reading books, especially the source books of the game you plan to run, since that's often one of the best ways to get started on developing inspirations for that sort of a game. Playing video games, watching movies and TV shows, but now there's a big difference. You're doing it all for a purpose. That purpose, of course, is that you're seeking inspiration. The gathering process is probably the most time-intensive of them all, especially since a lot of its really hard work is taking place in the background as you're doing other stuff. Still, it's good that you're aware that it's taking place, because that makes your job a lot easier when you shift into the next stage of the research process. Eventually, all the information you've been gathering will hit a saturation point, or maybe you'll just decide to kickstart yourself into action, or maybe you'll just run out of time and have to start the heavy crunch of data, turning it into something you can use as fast as you possibly can, because you promised your friends that you'd run a game on a certain date at a certain time, and you don't want to disappoint them. So now you shift into the sifting part of the research process. Sifting actually is probably the fastest part of research. Your primary purpose in sifting is to just tear through all the stuff you've already gathered and decide what you actually need. Some stuff you'll decide just has to be put to use. It's too perfect not to. Other stuff you'll really like and see that it's got potential, but you won't be able to use it right away. So you'll set it aside where you can get to it later when the present situation changes. And other stuff you'll realize just isn't appropriate at all, and you almost certainly won't ever use it, so you take note of where you threw it, just in case you really need to dig it out again in some really, really strange circumstances, but you do throw it somewhere, so that it won't clutter up your work, and then you move on. Most of what you've gathered will end up either in the wait-and-see pile or the junk heap, and I've personally found that the more brutal you are in the sifting process, the faster you get through it, and the more useful the final pile that you accumulate for putting together into a coherent game plot of the appropriate scope. Putting stuff together, of course, is the next step, which I call refining. You've settled on your core materials, the stuff from the game books and your various other sources that just clicks for you. Now you have to start making it work together. Seriously, if you've pulled some stuff from the Etrian Odyssey series of video games, and a few other big inspirations from the game Cyberpunk 2077, but you're planning to run a gritty street-level superheroes game, a la the Bourne series of films, but with more viable superpowers and near-magical alchemy instead of science as the source of those powers. There's similarities, sure, but you've got some work ahead of you to make sure that all the material you've been gathering and sifting actually manages to fit together into a coherent fashion. Most of this, of course, will end up being reskinning work, adjusting the genre and the minor specifics to fit the needs of your chosen setting. Still, it can be a time-consuming process, especially when you're going to be using this part of the process to put everything into the context of the system you've chosen for running this game. Personally, by the way, for a game like the one I just described, I'd suggest using the Tristat system, developed by Guardians of Order. Great system, excellent for running anything between down and dirty grit it till you crit, as in the Ghost Dog role-playing game, all the way up to the levels of crazy that you see in some Final Fantasy games, as in their Big Eyes Small Mouth flagship set of rules. But that's just me. All of this, naturally, leads us to the final stages of the role-playing game research process, namely, organizing everything we've got into something coherent. Now that you've got all your materials together, and they fit within the genre on which you've decided, and you can make all those ideas happen with the game system you're using, finally it's time to figure out when everything is going to take place. Organizing involves setting up a general timeline of events for your campaign. You've got stuff that you've decided absolutely must happen. There will be scenes you can visualize clearly in your head. Non-player characters you can almost literally see, hear, or even smell in the eye of your mind. A variety of boss monsters and lesser baddies with cool gimmicks and fights against them in interesting locations with unique challenges. Cool bits of loot, some of which might actually serve as character development, like the Master Sword from the Legend of Zelda series, the archetypal classic of magic items as major plot element, and character turning point in modern gaming, the same way the sword and the stone was for King Arthur in Middle Ages storytelling traditions. Whatever it is, organizing it means that you're going to be figuring out the when and the how behind making all that awesome stuff take place. You should probably write up a general campaign outline so that you can really get a handle on the whats and whens and wheres and hows of this process. Actually, this process of organizing will almost always remain an ongoing one, and your timeline will remain in a state of constant flux, since your players are going to be constantly throwing a monkey wrench into the gears of your mind as part of their usual activities. But that's okay. Seriously, it's fine. As long as you've written it down somewhere where you can get to it when you need it, no idea is ever lost, and no research is ever wasted. So far, I think I've made it pretty clear that I think it's okay to take and use other people's stuff, as long as you're not making a profit off of it, or otherwise somehow hurting someone else's bottom line. This is for your own personal games, with your friends, after all, and I don't see any harm in it. It saves time, and it lets you get right down to the business of enjoying a game a lot faster than might otherwise be possible. However, I should also point out, eventually, somewhere along the line, as you gain experience, and you've gradually shifted your source material further and further from its original form, one day you'll stop and think and look over all the work you've done and realize, hey, this is original. When and where and how this happens, I'm not entirely sure. But if you keep at it long enough, it will. So don't be ashamed of ripping off the works of others, at least to start. If you've ever seen the film Finding Forrester, and if you haven't, I think you should, you can watch how a brilliant young author works closely with a brilliant older author, at first copying his work, with the full permission of the older author to do so, I want to point out, and then gradually, over time, becoming steadily more original, more independent. Ideally, that is what will eventually happen to you. Unless it doesn't, and that's fine too. If you're happy using the works of others and your players are happy too, well, what's the problem? Me, I don't see any problem, because ultimately the goal of this hobby is to have fun with your friends. Serious fun. The greatest sort of fun, and of all, I firmly believe, comes from those moments when, together, you create something greater than any one of you could do alone. Thus, you, as the game master, are the one most in charge of fostering an environment where that can happen. And that means research, so that when you get to the game table, you'll have all the materials you need written down and ready in the format you need at a moment's notice. Hopefully at least some of this video was useful to you and has started you thinking of ways that you can develop your own campaign stories and how to take those first steps toward completing the research you'll need to do yourself as part of developing those stories into a coherent plot and setting. If you found anything I've said interesting so far, please hit the like and possibly subscribe buttons as a way of encouraging me to keep up the work. And with all of that said, and all of that done, I wish you all the very best.